Thank you very much, Zeke, for that introduction. Thank you all for that warm welcome. And I want to thank Ross in particular, who was organising this. He read that long list of sponsors. And in case you're wondering why was it necessary to have this long list of sponsors, the answer is that I don't speak without substantial fees. And you'll find out before I sit down why that is. So we're talking about this topic, which certainly is a relevant topic that we need to think about. It's true, as Zeke just said, that Ebola has made it more relevant in terms of helping us to see the links that global health has with our own situation. And perhaps there's something salutary about that as well. But I'm really talking about a larger picture of global health in which, tragic as the current Ebola outbreak is, it's actually pretty small in terms of numbers of deaths that are involved. We're going to start talking about global poverty because a lot of global health issues relate to global poverty. So what is it that we mean when we're talking about global poverty? So we're talking about the World Bank's definition. I'll be using that. People in extreme poverty essentially do not have enough income to provide for their basic needs, and this is needs really in the survival sort of sense of needs. And the amount that's used is this slightly complicated formula, purchasing power parity of $1.25, but that's in 1993 dollars. So if you want to know what the inflation has done for 1993 dollars, you could say $1.75 today. You wouldn't be very far out, certainly not more than $2. And purchasing power parity means it's how much in the local currency in a developing country buys the same parity as you can buy for that $1.75 or $2 in this country. So it's not currency exchange rate, because some of you will have traveled in developing countries and you will have said, oh, when I go to those countries and I give my US dollars, the money that I get back goes much further. I could buy a lot more food with it than I could buy in the US, for example. So I wouldn't, whereas in the US I'd be quite hungry if I had to live on $2 a day. If I'm in Botswana or Bangladesh or wherever, I wouldn't be. But that's not what we're talking about. That's not what the World Bank is talking about. It's talking about the amount in the local currency that will buy as much food as you can buy for that $1.75 in this country. So it's very, very little that we're talking about. And yet, there's over 1 billion people who are in extreme poverty as defined by the World Bank. Right, so what are the consequences of that? Well, the consequences are clearly, if you have that little income, you or your children are quite likely to be undernourished. You're likely to lack access to safe drinking water. You might not be able to send your children to school. You may not be able to afford even the most basic, inexpensive health care. Simply may not exist in where you're living if you're living in rural areas. Your children will die from diseases that don't exist in developed nations, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And your life expectancy at birth is going to be far less than it is in the developed world, maybe something around 48 to 50 rather than in the high 70s in the developed world. So clearly, extreme poverty has a huge negative impact on the lives of those who experience it. And the contrast with the billion or so people living in extreme poverty is that we have somewhat similar amount, 1 billion, a bit more than 1 billion, of people living in affluence. And what I mean by affluence is that they can meet all their needs and still have money over for things that they don't need, for things that essentially are luxuries or frills. Now, you may say, well, I'm a student, I don't have that much money. So ask yourself, did I spend money today or in the last few days on something to drink? Did I buy a drink when I could have simply gone to somewhere where there was a faucet and filled it up with safe water that I could have drunk? And if you did, then you've clearly spent something on something that is not a necessity. That's a luxury. Paying for a coffee or a soda or for bottled water, they're really all luxuries. And yet they're things that we do without thinking all the time. And if you add up even those small amounts, you won't be far off that amount that is the total daily income, that $1.75 or so for people in extreme poverty. And of course, most of us will spend much more than that. So even if you might think I'm not really well off, by global standards, you are among the affluent. And the figure at the end I talk about here, the fact that we spend so little on food, on groceries, is really historically unprecedented, because throughout human existence, we've either had to spend, or if we're talking about periods when money wasn't around, we've had to work for a large number of hours in order to provide for our basic needs for food. Now, we can work maybe 2 hours a week and we earn enough to feed ourselves if we are really just talking about meeting our nutritional needs. So that's another measure of the kind of affluence that we have. Why should you help? Why should this situation trouble us? This is an argument that I put up also. Zeke mentioned animal liberation's coming up for 40 years. This article actually was published in an academic journal in which I first put forward this argument a little over 40 years ago. And it's often been repeated. Some of you might have run across it in a course that you've taken or in something that you're reading. Essentially, it tells this little story. I'm not sure whether everybody at the back can read it, but it basically says, so you're walking across a park or maybe your campus, and there's a shallow pond there, and you notice that there's something splashing in the pond, and you look more closely and you see it's a small child who seems to have fallen in the pond and is in danger of drowning. So what do? The first thing I suppose you would do is you would say, who's looking after this child? This child's too small to be on his own. Must be some parents or a babysitter, but you can't see anyone. You don't know how it could have happened that this small child could have been alone and fallen into the pond, but that seems to be the situation. The next thought you have is, so I could easily save this child. I could run into the pond and I could pull the child out. There's no danger to me. The pond is shallow enough for me to wade into. I'm not going to drown. So I could rush in and pull the child out. But then perhaps a rather less noble thought occurs to you, and that is, oh, but I've put on my best outfit today and an expensive pair of shoes because I'm going to an important interview. And if I save this child now, I'm going to spoil my outfit, ruin my shoes, have to replace them probably, they won't dry out well, and I might be late for my interview and that'll be inconvenient. So is this child really my responsibility? It's not my child, never seen the child before. And I certainly am not responsible for the child being in this dangerous situation. I didn't push the child in the pond or take the child away from parents and let the child run around the park alone. So why is it my responsibility? Well, suppose that I had those thoughts and therefore I decided just to walk on. I decided to leave the child, probably going to drown. I can't see anyone else who's going to save the child. Maybe somebody will rush out of the bushes somewhere and still save the child in time, but probably not. And so I'm just going to walk on because the child's not my responsibility. So think for a moment about whether you would think that would be okay. Would that be an all right thing to do? And I assume that you will say no to that question. Occasionally I ask for shows of hands, and generally everybody puts their hand up. So I'm going to assume that anyway, at least 99% of you think that it would be a bad thing to do to walk on and leave that child probably to drown. And if some of you don't think that, you'll get a chance in question time to tell me why, but I'm going to speak to the 99% who think that it would be a bad thing to do. So the question then is, if you think that, you've acknowledged that you have a responsibility to people in need where you can, at small inconvenience, some inconvenience but not a great inconvenience, you can make a big difference to them. You can do something that is morally important, even though you're not responsible for the situation that they're in. So here's another way of looking at this argument. Start with a premise that I think is intuitively acceptable and that stands up to examination. If we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything nearly as important, we ought to do it. Okay, then here's a minor premise. Extreme poverty is bad. I think I showed that in the previous slides, why that's a bad thing. Like this example, it involves people dying. I'll go into more details about that. Children dying in ways that are preventable. And we can prevent some extreme poverty without sacrificing anything nearly as significant. Now that's a premise some of you may question. I'm going to say more to defend that in a moment. So if that's true, then I think the conclusion is we ought to prevent that from happening. So that's a kind of more formal statement of what I think you probably felt intuitively, that we ought to rescue that child, and an application of that to a somewhat different situation, the situation of extreme poverty in the world, coupled with the premise that we can do something about that. We're not impotent in regard to at least preventing some extreme poverty. I'm not talking about eliminating extreme poverty. None of us can do that. None of us individually, not everyone in this room, not even if you're as rich as Bill Gates and Warren Buffett put together, can you eliminate extreme poverty. Which is not to say that collectively it's not possible for all of the affluent people to do it. I think it probably is. But if we're just talking about what we can do, that's what the sum is doing on that side. We can make a significant difference, just as in the case of the drowning child, we could make a difference to one child. So at least that. Now, here's another philosophical way of putting it for those who are interested in underlying ethical principles. I happen to be a fan of this late 19th century Victorian philosopher, Henry Sidgwick. My most recent book is a discussion of his views on a range of different issues. He's one of the three great 19th century English utilitarians. The other two are actually better known. You've probably heard of Jeremy Bentham and you've probably heard of John Stuart Mill. You've probably not heard of Henry Sidgwick, but he's actually the best philosopher of the three. Not maybe the most original thinker, not maybe the best writer, certainly not the best writer, that goes to John Stuart Mill, but in terms of being writing a careful philosophical argument, the best of them. So what he's saying here is, if we look at what's happening from the point of view of the universe, not that the universe has a point of view, that's why he says, if I may say so. He's not saying that the universe is personal, but if we detach ourselves from our own situation here and now and take this larger picture, then we can see that my well-being doesn't really matter more than yours or yours or yours. And if I had a longer ability to point, I could point to people in other countries whose well-being matters just as much as mine, taken intrinsically for its own sake. There's no reason to prefer ourselves, there's no reason to prefer even our fellow countrymen or other people with which we have affinities. There's a sense in which everyone's well-being matters as much as anyone else's, and that, I think, is the most important sense, the most defensible, philosophically defensible sense in which we can say everyone is equal. So that's another way of putting the underlying premises that I'm talking about. Okay, but we don't actually act on this. We don't act to help people in extreme poverty in the way that I think probably overwhelmingly, most of us would act to save the child in the pond. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. One is we say, it's not my responsibility. As I said, some people might think that about the child in the pond, but if the child is right in front of you, not many. But when the child is far away, as the most easily preventable child deaths are, if you're living in an affluent country, then we think, why is this my responsibility? And we might mean different things by that. We might, for example, mean, it's my government's responsibility, and they're already helping, aren't they? So I pay for that through my taxes. Isn't that enough? I'll come to that in a moment. I might think, I'm helping at home, meaning I'm helping in my local community. Why isn't that enough? Why won't that do? And again, I'll say a little bit more about that. Another thing that people often feel is, we're really herd animals. We think that we're better than sheep, but in this respect, we tend to follow what other people do. There's lots of psychological research showing that if people see that others are helping, they're more likely to help. But if they don't, they're less likely to help. And unfortunately, in this area, there's a lot of people who are not helping, and when they do help, it's sometimes not evident. We have this idea that there's something boastful about telling people that you're giving to charity. And I think that that's unfortunate because it goes against this idea that more people will help if they see that others are helping. So we tend not to do things if we think we're the only one, and especially if that involves some kind of sacrifice that we think we would be making. So that's another factor, I think, why we don't help. And then we don't really know who we're helping. The point here is that if we're told about a particular person, I told you about a particular child in front of you, but even if the child is not in front of you, again, there's psychological research that shows if I show you a photo of an African child and I give her a name and an age and I say, she often goes to bed hungry, you can help her, then you're more likely to give than if I just tell you, as I have, and as I will say in more detail, there are lots of children in developing countries who go to bed hungry. So we seem to have evolved a compassionate or empathetic response to individuals we can see and identify, and that works in some cases close to us, but it doesn't work really well for this relatively novel problem, which of course did not occur previously in our evolutionary history, that we have the ability to help people thousands of miles away from us who we don't see. And that's one reason why I think we don't do more. And it may feel futile because we feel this problem is so big. I've told you how big it is. There's over 1 billion people in extreme poverty. And as I said, you can't solve that problem. And if we think that all we can do is just a tiny part of the problem, we're less likely to help. And again, this has been well documented in psychological research. If somebody says, for a given sum, let's say for $100, we can provide immunizations that will protect 500 children against measles, then, and there are 500 children who need this injection, you may be willing to help. But if we say there's 5,000 children who need injections against measles, and for $10 you can help 1,000 of them, people are actually less willing to help. Even though the economists among you will realize that you're actually getting better value in the second case for your dollars. For the same amount of money, you can immunize twice as many children. So economists would think that's what you ought to be doing. And in fact, I agree with them on this. It's the rational thing to do to get the best value you can for your dollar. But people have this sense of, oh, I can't solve the problem. I can only help some hundreds of these thousands of children who need help. And that's another sense of futility, which is a problem for this issue. And then there's this question that I think many people think: can I really help? And obviously I will then say, look, yes, there's charities, there's NGOs that will take your donation and help people in poverty. But many people will say, how do I know that they're really going to help? How do I know that my money will really get to the people who need it? And that's another big barrier to people giving. So let's look at some of these questions. Not going to be able to look at all of them. Firstly, let's look at this question about my government is already helping. Well, this is the most recent graph for official development assistance. That's the term for government aid to developing countries as a percentage of gross national income. This comes from the Norwegian government, which is why this is in purple at the top. That's Norway, if you can't see at the back. They're doing pretty well. This line is the United Nations recommended goal, 0.7%. It's not a very, it's not a really difficult goal, you would think. It's 70 cents in every $100 that the nation earns. Not a lot, but there's only these, 5 countries that meet it. The usual suspects, you could say: Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, Denmark, and actually just recently the United Kingdom. I think this is the first year that the United Kingdom, at least for many years, has passed this goal, which shows progress is possible. The Netherlands used to be on it, but they seem to have dropped just below it in the last year. Okay, so where's my government if you're paying your taxes to the United States? It's right down here. It's below Portugal. Just above Italy, that doesn't do very well, just above Spain, not doing well, a little bit above Greece, which, as you might have read, is having some financial difficulties, and so on. It's around, if you drop this down, what is it? It's just over 0.2, I think it's 0.23 or something like that. It's less than a quarter in every $100, less than 25 cents in every $100 we're earning. So I don't think we can say my government is doing a great job here, giving a lot in my name so I don't have to give. But Americans are very ignorant about this. There are surveys where Americans are asked, again, I don't know if you can see this, the question they're asked is, based on what you know, please tell me your hunch about what percentage of the federal budget goes to foreign aid. You can answer in fractions of percentage points as well as whole percentage points. This is not, the question they're being asked is not the same as the previous slide. It's not percentage of gross national income, it's percentage of the federal budget, of government spending. So the average response, and this is a particular survey, this is a particular survey done in 2010, but there have been pretty similar responses in a number of other surveys, so this is not a freak result. The average response is 25% of government spending, they think, of the federal budget goes on foreign aid. Then they get asked, what do you think would be an appropriate amount for the government to spend on foreign aid? And the median response there is 10%. So they're basically, most of the people asked think that the government is giving far too much for foreign aid. But when they're asked to name the figure for how much they think the government should give, they give a figure that's more than 10 times what the government actually is giving. So there's a huge amount of ignorance on this, which unfortunately politicians don't seem to be trying to seriously combat. We don't hear a lot of discussion about foreign aid in elections, for example, unless people are saying we're giving too much, reinforcing this view. So there's a huge misconception. And in fact, this 1% of federal government spending is even a slight exaggeration if you really get down to it. This is a graph of what the US is giving, and it's 0.7 of 1%. So it's really tiny compared to other government spending. Here's Medicare, Medicaid, and other health, 26.5. The biggest defense spending is 17%. Various other things, veterans benefits and services is 4.2%, so that alone is far more than, about 6 times what we're spending on all of our international aid and humanitarian assistance. All right, let me now talk about effectiveness in altruism. And there's an interesting new movement that is emerging that some of you will have heard about, and in fact some of you I know are already involved in, and some of you perhaps have not heard about. I think more people are starting to get involved in, and it's a really interesting development. It's called effective altruism, and it now is sufficiently noticeable to have a Wikipedia page. It didn't have that a year or two ago, and this is how it's defined: a philosophy and social movement which applies evidence and reason to working out the most effective ways to improve the world. So we've had aid and charity for a long time, but we haven't, until relatively recently, really tried to be rigorous about working out what works and what doesn't work, and what is the most cost-effective way of working to reduce poverty and to improve things like global health. Here's an example of what I think is a failure to really think about effectiveness. And this is a leaflet that you can find online called Finding Your Focus in Philanthropy. You find on the website of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, one of the biggest advisory groups that advises wealthy people and foundations about what to do with their money, responsible for advising billions of dollars in philanthropy. And in this booklet, you'll find this. This is in relation to the question about, so what's the most urgent issue? What issue should we work on? And they say there's obviously no objective answer to that question. And that's across the whole spectrum of philanthropy, which includes, for example, things like arts and culture, donating to museums and art galleries, and issues like global health and global poverty, and a range of other issues. And I think that this is a kind of phony, not well thought out subjectivism that we really should reject. Because I think even though there are some very difficult questions within this area among different causes, there are some causes which are so different that I think there really is an objective answer, and we ought to be looking for those objective answers and trying to find them. So here's an example where I think there's an objective answer. This is a painting by Duccio called the Stroganoff Madonna, after somebody who owned it, which was recently bought by the not that recently now, I guess a few years ago, was bought by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York for $45 million. So it's a fine painting. Duccio paintings are fairly rare, it's true. In terms of the Met's collection, no doubt it enhances it. But buying this painting wasn't necessary in order to preserve the painting. Of course, if the Met hadn't bid $45 million at auction for it, somebody else would have, and it would have been preserved somewhere else. It's a question of, is that a benefit to have this on display in the Met's already vast collection? Those of you who've been there will know it's difficult to look at every object in that collection in one or even several visits. So suppose that you were a donor who'd been approached by the Met, and this is indeed how the Met raised the money to buy this, a potential donor or a past donor, and they came to you and they said, we want you to put up some money so that we can bid on this Duccio at auction. Would that be a good thing to donate to? Well, if you donate, then this work will be in the Met's collection. People can look at it. By the way, it's not a very large painting. And because it's quite precious, when you look at it, you're going to look at it, it's a bit hard to see on this slide, but there is actually a glass, or maybe it's perspex box around it. So you don't get a really fantastic look at it, but you do get to see it. So that's one thing you could do with your money, contribute to this $45 million for this. Here's something else you could do with it. You could treat people who are at risk of developing trachoma. Trachoma is the largest cause of preventable blindness in the world. It's a condition that is caused by a microorganism that gets in the eyes of children. At first they hardly notice it, then it becomes an irritation, then gradually over years, I'm talking about maybe over 15 years or more, they will start to notice that their sight is not as good, and by the time they're around 40, they will be blind. This can be prevented, this can be treated. These children are lined up at a clinic to get the treatment, can be treated very inexpensively. There's varying estimates for how much it can be treated, but let's say it could be treated for $45 per case of blindness prevented. Now that figure I don't pluck out of the air. I'm taking $45 because it makes the maths very simple to work out how many treatments you could get for buying the Duccio. But it is within the range of estimates that are in published journals. In fact, the estimates, some of them go lower, like $25. Some of them may go higher, like $100. So $45 is reasonable. And if so, then you have to consider 1 million people who are going to be blind from the age of 40 on, and they may live another 10, 20, 30 years with blindness. And they're poor people, they're in developing countries, so they don't get very much assistance. They're not going to be able to earn income. Somebody else is going to have to support them. It's an even worse situation than being blind if you're in an affluent country. Can you really compare the benefit you get by getting this painting hanging in a museum, in your favorite museum, let's say, in your city, with preventing 1 million people being able to see anything at all? That seems to me to be a pretty easy decision to make. So I think there are objective answers to this question of, is one cause more effective than another? And I think causes that relate to helping the poor and dealing with their global health problems are pretty clear ones. But we still need to say a little bit more about effectiveness and how we can actually assess effectiveness even within particular areas. So let's look at that question for a moment. Stay with the issue about blindness. Many of you will have seen appeals to train guide dogs for people who are blind in this country. And you will have thought, oh, that's a good cause. It's good that people who are blind should have the assistance of a service dog to help them negotiate their way around the world. Sure, it is a good cause. Other things being equal, it would be good to donate to those organisations. But unfortunately, other things aren't equal, because there are a lot of people who are blind from preventable causes, causes that people are not blind from in this country. And as I just said, we can more cheaply prevent them from becoming blind. So if you look at the figures here, the cost of training a dog to be useful to a blind person and training the blind person to be able to use the dog effectively is around $40,000. It's quite an expensive process because of the labour involved. I'm talking about organisations in the United States that are doing this. Well, you've just heard the figures for trachoma that I just mentioned. So you could prevent maybe 1,000, maybe 800, maybe at the lower figures as many as 2,000 people from becoming blind by donating to organisations that are treating trachoma in developing countries. So that's an example. I said before, people sometimes say, well, I'm helping at home, I'm helping in the United States, I'm helping my local communities. But the fact is, this is reasonably typical of the cost difference in effectiveness because there are so many problems that are inexpensive to treat in developing countries, whereas those problems are all dealt with here, or virtually all dealt with. We don't have people who are blind because of trachoma. We don't have people who are blind because of cataracts. Cataract surgery is another way of restoring sight for people in developing countries. There are millions of people with cataracts in developing countries who can't see because they can't afford the surgery. There aren't here. So we just get much better value for our dollars when we help people in extreme poverty elsewhere in the world than we get when we are working with local organizations here. And that's something that the effective altruism movement is emphasizing, how much more bang for our buck we get when we work with the global poor. Now, I mentioned earlier, you might say, well, how do I know that a particular charity that I give to is really okay? How do I know that it will do what it purports to be doing with the money I donate, that it really will make a significant difference? And again, fortunately, in relatively recent years, we have got some decent research on this. GiveWell is a pretty new organization. I think it got going, went public in 2007, maybe, something like that. Started by a couple of young guys working for a hedge fund who were making a lot more money than they'd expected to be making in their 20s, and decided they would give some of it away. And a group of them at the hedge fund said, well, where should we give it to? And they said, well, what about this one? What about that one? But then they said, well, how do we know that they're good? How do we know what they're doing? And each of them said, I'll write to my favorite organization and I'll ask them what they do and how they can show that they would be the right one to donate to. So they wrote to them. And remember, these are hedge fund guys who spend their lives analyzing companies to decide who to invest in, getting lots of real data to make good investment decisions. And therefore, they were a bit shocked to find that what they got back were glossy brochures with photos of smiling kids and a lot of platitudes about what the organization would do, and pretty much no real data. So even when they followed up with phone calls and other things and said, look, we're not thinking of giving you $50, we're thinking of giving you $50,000 maybe, they still didn't get serious data. And so they decided, a couple of them decided to leave the hedge fund and set up this organization that would do rigorous research. And that's what it's doing. And it reviews a lot of charities. There's a pie chart here. You can hardly see the outline of it. And it recommends a tiny number of them. That doesn't mean that the rest of them are no good. It just means that the rest of them have not been able to demonstrate with sufficient rigor that they are really highly cost effective. So there's a small number of organizations recommended, and you can go online to givewell.org and you can find effective organizations according to GiveWell. Some people think they're too rigorous, that there are lots of other effective organizations, and in fact I'm somewhat of that opinion, but I do think that they've done enormously valuable work. There are other lists. So Giving What We Can, which is an organization that's setting up here at Penn, and that I hope many of you will want to join and support. Giving What We Can is an international organization that does this, so you can go online to givingwhatwecan.org and you'll find that they also have information, they also have information on finding the best charities. They have a somewhat different, slightly different list, but these lists all overlap extensively. And I wrote a book a few years ago called The Life You Can Save, and an organization has kind of spun off of that. And it also has lists of top charities. So you can find good charities where you can be highly confident that they will be effective in terms of what you're giving. And that, I think, is why that premise of the argument I gave you before, that we can reduce some extreme poverty or help some people in extreme poverty, why that premise is actually justifiable. Okay, now, we are going to play some sort of a game here as part of this event, and this relates to the point I said earlier when I first stood up about why I insist on getting a paid fee to speak. money can do good things. Money can make a difference, and if I can transfer some resources from the University of Pennsylvania to some of the world's poorest people, then I'm going to do that. So a giving game is something that has been sort of set up again, something that's been going for just a couple of years, and it's to encourage you to think critically about effectiveness. And I'm going to donate from my fee $5 for every one of you here in the room. I was told that the capacity of the room is such that I won't be up for more than $3,900 for doing that. So up to that amount. And each of you will get to choose which of 3 charities the $5 that I'm personally sort of donating to you, except you can't take it for yourself, is going to go to. So after the event, you're going to be able to vote online for where you want that to go to, and I will make sure that the amount of money that reflects the votes will go to the charities. But I'm not letting you donate to just anyone, because I do want your choices to be effective. So to some extent, insofar as this is an election, it's a bit like the elections that the government of China wants Hong Kong to have. So here are my approved candidates. So the Against Malaria Foundation is a highly effective organisation that distributes bed nets to people in malaria-prone regions. The cost of the bed net is about $6 distributed, but of course that doesn't mean you can save a life for $6. Sometimes these figures can be a little misleading, because obviously not everybody would die of malaria without a bed net, otherwise there wouldn't be anybody living in the region at all. But if you distribute enough bed nets, you do save lives. That's been clearly documented by randomized controlled trials, the sort of trials that are done to test pharmaceuticals. The Proven Impact Fund is something that is an offshoot of this organisation called Innovations for Poverty Action, which is an organisation that tests various poverty-related ventures, projects, set up at Yale University by Dean Carlin, who's an economist. And so they have set up this fund to channel funds to the organisations that they have tested and that they regard as highly effective. So that's not specific. You don't know exactly where your money is going, but you know that it has been rigorously checked by the by IPA. And Give Directly is an interesting one for those who say, how do I know that my money will really get to the poor people? So Give Directly is, again, pretty new, set up only, I think, 3 or 4 years ago by people at Harvard who had studied economic development. And one of the things that they found is there were a small number of programs that don't do things like provide bed nets or provide cows or other things that you might have heard of, but they simply transfer money to people in poverty. So there's a really simple idea. You might say, well, if people are poor, why not just give them money? And then other people will say, well, no. If you just give them money, they'll spend it on alcohol or gambling or who knows what. They'll fritter it away and it won't get them out of poverty. And these guys said, well, let's see if that's the case. Let's do a randomized trial. Let's find poor people in some villages, give them some money, and check that against people who we don't give money to, who are equally poor. Single them out and make it random as to, you know, we get 1,000 poor people and we give money to a randomly selected 500 of them and we see whether they're better off or not. So that's what Give Directly has done, working particularly in East Africa. And in order to avoid making people dependent, it's not going to give people money sort of indefinitely. It says to them, we are going to give you $1,000. We're going to give it to you, I think usually they give it in about 3 installments. They don't give them to it all at once. And the technology that they use to make sure that they actually get the money is, again, uses communications that were not possible before. in a lot of developing countries, people can bank via mobile phone. They have a mobile phone connection. They don't have a branch of a bank or anything like that near them, but they can use their phone to get credits and to pay for things. Well, of course, people in extreme poverty don't have mobile phones. So Give Directly goes to them and says, we're going to give you a mobile phone, a very cheap mobile phone, and we're then going to give you these credits which will add up over a year or so to $1,000. So think about what you're going to do with it. And they've been doing that, and they've been doing the trials, and they find that essentially these people are spending it on things that basically are improving their living standard. That the amount that they're spending on alcohol or gambling or prostitution does not increase beyond the fact that they've got as a percentage of their overall spending. The biggest single item that people are spending it on in this part of Africa is people who are poor have thatched roof on their dwelling. A thatched roof is not very satisfactory, partly because it leaks in heavy rain, and partly because you have to replace it every year at a cost of something like $50. And people who are poor can afford to do that, but they can't afford to replace the roof with corrugated iron, which of course lasts a decade or more, but which costs some hundreds of dollars. So that's the biggest, most common single item, large item of expenditure. They replace their roof, which is a good investment both in keeping themselves and their food supply and possessions dry and saving them money over many years to come. So you can give to that, and Give Directly's operating costs they cover with 10% of the amount you give. So if you give them $5, then 50 cents will go to Give Directly, $4.50 will go to directly or together with others to help impoverished families. So that's the choice that you're going to get, and this is going to give you more information and show you where you can go. So thelifeyoucansave.org, which is the organisation I mentioned that spun off the book, and Peter-Singer-Pen-Giving Game will get you to the page where you can get more information about the organisations, and you can decide what you want to do with your $5. So we hope that'll be an interesting and educational experience for you, and will produce money for some effective charities. Okay, we're nearly done. I'm just going to say one more thing about the motivations and what effective altruists do. So you might think that what effective altruists do is they go and work for aid organisations, or they become doctors or healthcare workers in developing countries. And some of them do exactly that. But the movement is broader than that, and I want to give you one example which those of you who don't know anything about effective altruism may surprise some of you. Some of them go to Wall Street. This is a student who was in one of my classes about 3 years ago called Matt Wager. He was a philosophy major with a math background as well. He did extremely well in philosophy. In fact, he got the department's prize for the best thesis in his final year, and had offers to go to outstanding graduate programs, including the University of Oxford, which was attractive, and he could have, I think, had a successful career. Perhaps still could, I should say, he's young, still could have a successful career as an academic. But at the moment, he's chosen not to do that. And the reason he's chosen not to do that is he wants to maximize the amount of good he can do in the world. And while as a professor of philosophy, it is possible to do some good, he thinks you can do more if you can earn a lot of money and give a lot of money away. So already just, he's now slightly over a year, I think, after graduating, but he's earning enough to be able to give away a six-figure sum. Now, obviously, to do that, he's not living the lifestyle of some of his co-workers on Wall Street. And you might say it will take a special kind of character to stick to that. So this may not be for everyone. If you think that if you're in a work environment where your friends all have luxurious apartments and drive Ferraris, then you would also want to do the same, then perhaps this is not the best for you because you're not going to be able to give away that much. But if you think you have the commitment to stick with your plans and if you think you'd be reasonably happy in this work environment, and Matt says he is, says he quite enjoys the challenges of the day-to-day work, then that's an alternative. And it's an alternative which, you know, is controversial in some ways. You might say, oh, well, he's working for Wall Street, he's propping up an inequitable system. But you have to say, okay, but if he wasn't doing that, there's plenty of other people who would take his job and would be doing the same, and they would not be giving $100,000 to effective charities. So maybe he's still doing more good than that. Or you might say, why didn't he go and work for a charity? He could have done a lot of good for them. True, but again, there's no shortage of good people wanting to work for charities. So the difference he would have made would have been just the marginal difference between what he can do and what the next best applicant could do, assuming he would have got the job. Whereas with $100,000 a year, a charity could employ 2 completely additional people. And they're probably going to be able to do more good than the marginal difference that he would have made choosing to work for that charity. So that's why this is an interesting, relatively novel idea for how you can be an effective altruist. So motivation, there's lots of different motivations. But I think this is an important part from a book by a Canadian philosopher called Richard Keshen about self-esteem. He starts with the idea of what a reasonable person should be able to feel. A reasonable person, somebody who, I'm sure you're all reasonable people, who want to be informed about the world, who want to know their situation in the world, who want to think about that and want to judge the way they're living on the basis of evidence and accurate information. So a reasonable person, Keshen says, can't have self-esteem while ignoring the interests of others whose well-being he or she regards as equally significant. That goes back to the Henry Sidgwick principle that I showed you early on. And I think that that's true, and I think that self-esteem is an important part of well-being, that is, your own well-being. So if you want to feel fulfilled, satisfied with your life, then I think feeling that you're living in accordance with your values and that those are reasonable values is an important part of that. And I think that's at least one of the reasons why there's a lot of research that shows that people who are helping others, people who are generous, charitable, actually enjoy their lives more than people who don't. And in fact, you have somebody here at Penn, Adam Grant at the Wharton School, author of the book, recent book Give and Take, who puts together, summarizes a lot of that research in that particular book. So have a look at that if you want a further example. And I'm going to close with one example of somebody that I've knew for many years, unfortunately no longer with us. This goes back to the other interest that Zeke mentioned of mine at the start, my interest in the animal movement. Henry Spira was, I'd say, the most effective, single most effective activist in the animal movement in the late 20th century. And if you pick up a bottle of shampoo or a cosmetic that says on it, not tested on animals, it was Henry who started the movement, made the movement effective, that made that claim, made it possible for that claim to be true. So, in the 90s, I was living in Australia. It was before I'd come to Princeton. And I got a call from Henry one day. And he said to me, you know, Peter, you said once that you wanted to write about the methods that I've used to be effective in the animal movement. And I said, yeah, I'd still like to do that one day. You know, one day when we're together, we'll get together and I'll interview you and we'll talk about that. And he said, well, maybe you should do it soon. And I said, why? And he said, because I've just been told that I've got cancer and I've probably only got a few months to live. So I did come over and I did a series of interviews with him, some of which are actually on a videotape. We videoed them, and you can go online and find a video called Henry One Man's Way, which includes extracts of that. And Henry, at that time, although he knew that he didn't have long to live, was actually remarkably calm and satisfied, felt satisfied with his life. And he felt that he'd used his time well. And this is kind of the kind of thing that he said. I also did write about it. You know, he said that basically he felt he could look back on his life and he could feel that he'd enjoyed it. He'd enjoyed it because he'd felt that he was doing something that was good, and that had drawn out his energy and his ability. He'd invested in that, and it was not a sense of duty that made him want to help animals or do, he did various other things, by the way. He's not just an animal person. Before he got into the animal movement, he marched for civil rights in the South in the 60s. He worked for oppressed unionists against corrupt union bosses and so on. But he'd always said, this is what he wants to do, this is what he feels best at doing. And I think that's the best possible motivation that you can have.